Okay. It really didn't. It didn't hit Akron too bad. I had a lot of leaves and branches and stuff, but nothing really crazy. So what we're going to be talking about, continuing on, is talking a little bit about natural selection and evolution and all of that good stuff. And to put it pretty simply, we're looking at winners in nature versus losers in nature. And maybe we don't like to talk about things as winners or losers, but nature is not a kind thing. So one of the things that you're going to be looking at as we come up on the next week of lab is looking at biomagnification and agricultural pests. What that is basically, if you think about grasshoppers or caterpillars, those type of agricultural pests can be very devastating to our food crops, and if farmers don't use pesticides or herbicides, we can end up not having enough food to feed our nation. And so most of the agricultural pests that we have are going to progressively start to develop resistance to those pesticides. And then we can look at how that happens. So let's look at natural selection in action. If we have 3 different rabbits, and the rabbits have variations for a trait. So let's say that we have a group of rabbits that are very fast, a group of rabbits that are medium fast, and a group of rabbits that are very, very slow. And that speed ability is passed along from parent to offspring. So in natural selection, we have to see, first of all, variation for a trait. Second of all, we have to see that the trait can be passed along from parent to offspring. So fast bunnies mate with other fast bunnies and have fast babies. The medium speed bunnies are going to mate together, have medium speed babies, and then the very, very slow bunnies are going to mate together and have very, very slow babies. So if you're a rabbit, there's 2 things that you're basically trying to do out in nature. You're trying to gather food so that you can get fat and happy and have lots of babies, and you're trying to stay away from predators. So predators are going to affect your reproductive success because the predators are going to, first of all, catch all the very, very slow rabbits. Then, if the predators are so hungry, they're going to catch the next set of slowest rabbits. And the fastest rabbits are going to be able to get away. So what we're basically doing here, to put it kind of harshly, is we're removing the losers from the population. So the loser rabbit that can't run away from the predator is going to be the one that dies and doesn't get to pass on its speed ability to the offspring. So we're going to see this happen in a continually, gradually moving forward type of manner, because as the predators catch all of the slow rabbits, then they're going to have to go out and look for the little bit faster rabbits, and they'll catch all of those. But if you are a slow predator and you can't catch enough prey items to meet your needs, then you will be the one that dies off. So if you ever wondered about the evolution of speed in animals in nature, things like a gazelle that's being chased by a cheetah, or things that are being chased out on the African plains, it's the slowest that are usually going to be the losers, and the fastest that are going to be the winners. Those are going to be the ones that get to go on and pass their speed on to their offspring. And so we see natural selection happen all the time in nature. Another case of natural selection would be something like camels. I don't know if I talked to you about camels yet, but if you go out into the deserts, you don't usually see too many really big animals. Desert animals are usually pretty tiny. You think of like tarantulas and scorpions and lizards and snakes. You don't see too many large mammals like camels out in the desert. And one of the reasons that they are so well adapted to their environment is that they have very long eyelashes so that they can keep the sand out of their eyes, because if the sand was blowing into their eyes and they were being blinded, then They're not going to be able to find food and get fat and happy and have babies. They're also the same color as the sand so that they can kind of blend into their background. They have very thick pads on their toes so that they don't sink down into the sand. That's why you don't ride a horse out into the sand. You ride a camel because the camel's pads of their toes spread out and they're thick so that they're not scorched by that burning earth. And they have that giant hump that makes it so that they can carry their food and water supply for many weeks on their backs without dying in this harsh environment. So through natural selection, animals like camels have become very well adapted to their environments. You can probably think of lots of other animals that are well adapted to their environments. You wouldn't find a camel at the North Pole because it's not suited to that environment. But you would find a polar bear, or you would find a seal or sea lion. Seals and sea lions are very well adapted to their environment because they have a thick layer of blubber to keep them from freezing in the cold. So just as there are all kinds of different environments around the world, that's why we have such a vast array of different species that we see out there. So one of the words that you often hear kind of tossed around, or the phrases you hear tossed around, is survival of the fittest. And what we tend to think of when we hear survival of the fittest is that the strongest will survive. So the strongest, best of the species are going to survive and be able to pass on their abilities to their offspring. But when we talk about fitness or talk about the fittest in nature, what we're really trying to explain is the relative amount of reproduction of an individual with a particular phenotype. So to break that down, what that means is the amount of babies that are being output by an individual that has certain traits. So we see that word phenotype and we think of traits. So we have some that are going to be very well adapted to that environment, and they're going to have lots of babies with lots of those good traits. And then there are going to be others of the individuals that are going to be the losers of that environment, and they're not going to be able to put out babies with those traits. So the fastest of the rabbits is going to be able to survive. The slowest of the rabbits is not going to be able to survive. But what this means when we're talking about fitness is that they have to have reproductive output. They have to be able to have babies that have those traits. Otherwise, if you're a very fast rabbit that has no babies, then you're not going to pass that trait on to your offspring. Therefore, it's not a survival of the fittest type of situation. If you have very, very slow rabbits, that are also able to be really sneaky and hide really well, and they can have lots and lots of babies, but those lots and lots of babies get eaten a lot because they have more babies than the organism with the variations of the traits. Then whoever has the most babies that are able to survive and pass on the trait is really the one with the highest fitness. So when we've talked about the fruit fly example in class a little bit, where we have one fruit fly, or we have a population of fruit flies in an experiment in the lab where we take away their food and see how long they can survive, and they start to die off and die off and die off. And then we keep the ones that have survived the longest, we give them back their food, allow them to reproduce, and then we take the food away again, and the ones that can survive the longest, then we let those reproduce and have their babies. So we see that we have different versions of these alleles, different versions of these traits. There are going to be some fruit flies that can survive and reproduce, and there are others that are going to be less adapted to the environment and are therefore not going to be able to pass along those traits to offspring. So the fly with the greater fitness is the one that can have the greater reproductive success, the greater number of babies surviving to pass that trait on and have that trait in the next generation. So when we talk about alleles, remember back to our genetics discussion, we're talking about alleles carried by individuals with high fitness will increase their market share. So what that means is if they have an allele that is successful, that is an adaptation that makes them able to survive, they will have more babies and increase the amount of that gene that are out there in the gene pool over time, and that population will evolve. So the number of those alleles that are in the gene pool will change over time, and that's what evolution is. It's the strongest, the fittest, the ones that have the most babies are the ones that are able to survive and pass on their traits to their offspring, and the ones that are not well adapted to the environment are eventually going to be basically bred out of the environment. So there are three important elements to an organism's fitness. The first is that it's measured relative to other genotypes or phenotypes in the population. So what that means is we've got an individual that has a trait, and it's got to have different traits than others of the same species in that population. So we're not talking about different species mating together. We're talking about a population of the same species that have variations. We know that that is true just by looking around at all of us. We are all humans, but we all have different traits. And some of those traits may help us to survive and reproduce and pass on our genes to our offspring. And that's why we are an example of changing demographics, changing alleles over time in a population. So the individual's fitness is measured relative to everyone else's of that same species. The second thing is that fitness depends on the specific environment that the organism lived in. If we, as humans, were to go look back at our ancestors and trace back our genetics to wherever it is that we came from, I know if I look back at my father's line of the family, that I can trace them back to the Mayflower coming over from England, and so I can look at where my genetics have come from. My son is obviously going to have different genetics because he's got my Hollingsworth portion of the genetics, but he's also got his father's, which come from Mexico. And so he's going to have an entirely different survival strategy than I would have. So think about the differences between Mexico and England. Those are obviously going to have different ways of helping humans to be able to survive. So this happens in nature too. Here we're looking at two different mice. They're of the same species, but if you have some of those mice that are living in a light sandy colored backdrop, then if you are a dark mouse living on a light background, that makes you a target for all of the predators. So what will happen is if you've got that variation in the population, the ones that have that loser type of genes that make them dark, that make them a target, are going to be the ones that are going to be picked out of the population, and therefore the population will continue to get lighter and lighter as they camouflage better into the background over several generations. If, however, you have the same group, the same species, that are on a dark background, let's say we've got some that are in the sand, and we've got some that are on like a volcanic lava, dark-colored background, then the dark ones would be able to blend into the backgrounds, and the light ones would stick out like a sore thumb. And those would be the ones that would be picked off by the predators. And so here you can see that just by having variations in those alleles, having variations on the traits, depending on what the environment is, it could mean that one trait is very advantageous in one set of mice, and in another set of mice, the other completely opposite trait is going to be the advantageous one. So we will see these populations change over time just simply because we have differing environments, and the differing environments make certain genes more conducive to being alive than other ones are. So think about what can be eaten by predators and what's going to blend into the backdrop. So camouflage, evolution of camouflage is an amazing thing here. Then the third element that's important to an organism's fitness is that it has to have reproductive success compared to other organisms in the population. It has to be able to have lots of babies that pass on those traits to the offspring and the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. So if we were to have an organism that was very strong and very fit and very well adapted to the background, but was sterile, was not capable of passing on their genes to their offspring, then their fitness would be zero. Because if you can't pass along your traits to your offspring, then it doesn't matter whether you have the trait or not. You cannot expect to see it in the next generation if you can't have babies, if you're sterile. So on the other hand, if you inherit an allele that gives you a trait that causes you to die at half of the age of everyone else, but also helps you to have twice as many offspring, then your fitness is increased. So a good example of this would be heart disease in humans. So heart disease tends to affect older individuals, but it doesn't affect them at the time that they're passing on their genes to their offspring, at the time that they're reproducing. So if you have heart disease, it's not going to affect your reproductive output because it doesn't have anything to do with how many babies you have. Things like cancer or Parkinson's disease, those things often affect older individuals. It doesn't affect them during the baby-making strategy period. And so what you're going to see is that as organisms are able to pass on their traits to their offspring, whatever helps them to have the most babies, whatever makes it so that they have the best reproductive success is going to be is going to up the organism's fitness. It's going to make their fitness higher than other individuals. So if I was going to think of another example of this, I think of like bodybuilders. You know how if you have a bodybuilder who takes lots of steroids and lots of hormones and he gets nice and big and strong, and then his testicles shrink and he can't have children. He may be nice and strong, but he can't have babies. So therefore, his reproductive success would be zero. So you have to see things that are increasing the amount of offspring that you can have, along with increasing the traits that help you to survive. So survival of the fittest, we call that kind of a misnomer. Sometimes the strongest don't survive. Sometimes it's the sneakiest that survive. There's a lot of examples in nature where, especially in insects or in birds, where they're very, very sneaky about getting their sperm and passing it along to the female, and they're able to sneak in there around the stronger males who are so worried about strutting their stuff or looking like a big, hot bird. So survival of the fittest is not necessarily survival of the strongest. It's survival of the one that can have the most babies that survive over time. So here we can see that we have different types of environments, different types of environments around the globe, and so therefore something that would survive in Africa wouldn't necessarily survive in North America. Something that would survive at the poles wouldn't necessarily survive at the equator. Something that survives on land wouldn't necessarily survive in the water. So organisms in a population can become better matched to their own specific environment, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the perfect organism. There's no such thing as the perfect species because there's no such thing as a stable environment. Our environment is always changing. So in this we talk a lot about adaptation, which you need to know the formal definition of. Adaptation is the process by which organisms become better matched to their environment and the specific features that make an organism more fit. This occurs as a result of natural selection. So nature is selecting the ones that are the best adapted to being able to survive in that specific environment with those specific features. So best matched to their own environment, their own specific environment, that they have specific features that make them more fit, more capable of having reproductive success, and as a result, that would be what natural selection would be. Nature basically choosing the winners and the losers. Got it? Okay. Okay. So, like I said, natural selection does not lead to perfect organisms. So one of the greatest examples of this would be the Galapagos Island finches. So we've talked so much about these finches and how they have their different beak sizes. And so in one of the case studies of the Galapagos Islands, they looked at the amount of drought, the periods of rainy seasons and dry seasons on the Galapagos Islands since 1976. And they found that in this period between 1976 and 1984, there were 3 peak dry years where they didn't get very much rain. And so because they didn't get very much rain during those periods, in the dry years, the finches that had the largest, hardest beaks that could crack seeds, and they were bigger beaks, those would be the organisms that would be selected for. So the ones that could survive were the ones that were able to eat the food supply in these dry years. And then in the valleys of those years, the wet years, in the wet years, finches could eat small, soft foods, and the finches with the smaller beaks were the ones that were selected for. So what it looks like from this example right here is that in wet years, smaller beaks do better. In dry years, bigger, harder beaks do better. And so adaptation doesn't give us, neither one is a perfect organism. Neither one is not going to ever change. They're going to continue to fluctuate. They're going to continue to adapt and change as their environment changes. And as we have all seen, the weather is unpredictable. And because the weather is such a severe force in the environment, in all different kinds of environments around the world, we're never going to see organisms stop changing, because there's always going to be some organisms that are better adapted to the environment and some that are going to be worse adapted, and then that changes and fluctuates based upon the weather, based upon the climate, based upon a lot of different seasonal factors of our ecology, of our Earth. And so nothing ever stops changing. So the reason natural selection doesn't lead to the production of perfect organisms is because we are not ever going to have the Earth with just one environment. We're not ever going to have a completely ice-covered Earth. We're not ever going to have a completely tropical Earth. If we only had one season and it were tropical, then maybe we would see some organisms that would survive and be the ultimate organism. But because the Earth never stops changing and it's never going to be one environment for the whole thing, we will never see the perfect organism. So here's kind of the review of what I just had you write down. Environments are going to be changing very quickly. As we all know, we can see the environment, we can see the weather, and we can see the climate change. We're not just talking about 1 year here. Sometimes we're talking about over the period of 100 years, or even 1,000 years, or 1,000,000 years. Thinking of like ice ages, or thinking of droughts, or tropical places. So the thing that we need to have in order to see different types of organisms is we need to see variation. So variation is this raw material of selection. Variation among the same species in a population, and variation among different species that are predators and prey and evolving together, called coevolution. There may be multiple different alleles for each trait, which cause an individual to have the same fitness. So what we may see is that some traits may be passed along with traits that are really good, and some traits may be passed along with traits that are really bad, because sometimes genes are going to code for multiple traits. We don't just see them coding for one, we see them coding for some things that are linked together. A lot of times you see like dark skin and dark hair being passed along together, light skin and light hair being passed along together. If you've ever, everybody's stopped to look at somebody who's got red hair and has the freckles, those things are often passed along together. So sometimes those things that are bundled together in a gene are going to be passed along together, so there's no leaving that gene out. So here's another example of selection, but in this case we would call it artificial selection. Farmers or apple growers are able to pick the different traits that they want for their crops, and therefore that's why we see so much variation in our apple crops out there. Farmers can choose whether they want to breed together the green apples or the red apples or the combination of the two. Sometimes they make them tart, sometimes they make them sweet, sometimes the apples are really big, sometimes they're really small. And because we see so much variation among apples, we're able to artificially select the characteristics that we want and breed them together and get new offspring. And that's why maybe a couple of years ago or 20 years ago, you only saw a couple varieties of apples. But now if you go to the grocery store, you may see 20 different varieties of apples. And it's just going to get more complex in the future. Maybe we'll eventually see 100 different species of apples, and we'll be able to choose which of them is our favorite. But you know, we all also have taste. Some of us like different types of apples, and that's why artificial selection is important. So artificial selection is basically natural selection, but chosen by humans. So natural selection can change the traits seen in populations in several ways. Here's what we're seeing with two different ways that natural selection works. We can either see a specific change in a population, like if we see a change in the amount of dimples in the chins. So some traits, I don't know what that was. Some traits such as the shape of the chin can be passed along that don't affect reproduction. And then sometimes we see this continuous range. So in chins, you either have that dimple or you don't have that dimple. But then when we see traits like height, we see lots of variation. So we see continuing traits where we go from very, very short all the way up to very, very tall and everything that's in between. So whichever a given trait is that's influenced by our genes or by this complex interaction of many genes in the environment is subject to natural selection and changes in several ways. So notice we're not ever just talking about one thing changing. We're often talking about this bundle of things that are changing over time. So traits can either be either or they can be continuous traits that have lots of variations in between. And so chins and height is an example of that. Okay. Going back to artificial selection, in the environment, since we do see so many variations, sometimes individuals with one extreme from the range of variation in population have higher fitness. So what that means is if we look at things like milk production in dairy cows, the more milk the cow produces, the better it is for the farmer. The more money the farmer is going to make. So what he's going to do is he's not ever going to pick the cows that don't make very much milk and breed them with cows that make a lot of milk. He's going to pick cows that make a lot of milk and bulls that are the offspring of cows that make a lot of milk, and he's going to mate them together, and that next generation is going to have offspring that produce even more milk. And so what we do is we call that directional selection. So we're moving in the direction of the characteristic that we want. So in this case, it would be milk production. Farmers only breed together the cows that make lots of milk. So in one direction. Here's another example of directional selection. Turkeys on poultry farms can no longer mate together naturally because farmers have picked the turkeys that have the biggest breasts, because the more breast meat that they have, the more money they're going to make the farmer. And so what the farmer found was that if you have a turkey that has a breast that's so large that it can't mate with another turkey, then you wipe out the population or the possibilities of this population having offspring. So they've actually gone towards artificially inseminating turkeys so that they have breasts that are so large now that the turkeys can't ever mate together on their own, because the male turkey penis cannot even reach the female because his breast is so large. So what we call this is selective pressure. So the farmers are always going to select against the turkeys with the smallest breast, and they're always going to pick the ones that do have the biggest breasts. And so you're going to see this shift in population, whereas 20 or 30 years ago, turkeys had to breed together naturally because the farmers didn't have artificial selection. Now, because artificial selection or artificial insemination is just kind of the norm, now we have turkeys that couldn't possibly mate together. So if you were to release the turkey population out into the wild, that would be the extinction of the turkey population, because they could never breed together. So you see from this graph here, it's really kind of interesting. If you go from the smallest of the turkey breasts up to the largest of the turkey breasts, and then you see on the other axis the proportion of individuals in the population, you can see that the curve of the graph has shifted in the direction of the turkeys having larger breasts, and that means that the alleles of these turkeys have evolved towards having a larger breast. We also see that in things like fish, when we're breeding together bigger fish. We actually see this happening in humans, where we're actually undoing natural selection. Because of medical technologies now, and because of being able to keep offspring alive that normally would not have lived. If you think about 20 or 30 years ago, if you had a baby and the baby needed to be kept in an incubator, hospital may not have had the incubators to keep the babies alive. But now, because we have such advanced technologies, we're able to keep children alive that are born earlier and earlier and earlier. It used to be, if your baby was born before 35 weeks, it wouldn't survive. Now it's up to something like 24 weeks. If a baby is born at 24 weeks, it can actually survive thanks to medical technology. So looking at one of the characteristics, there is a natural variation in human birth weights. If we were to go through this whole class here and ask everybody, well, how much did you weigh when you were born? You would see from 4 pounds probably all the way up to 10 or 11 pounds. There is a natural variation in the weight of human babies. So we call this stabilizing selection. This is where individuals with the intermediate or the in-between phenotypes are termed to be the most fit. Imagine if 100 years ago you were going to have a baby. If your baby was born too small, then it would die. If the baby was too big to pass through the birth canal, both the mother and the baby would die. So the stabilizing selection selected for babies that were born at a weight where they were big enough to survive, but not too big to kill the mother in the process. And so stabilizing selection selected for the medium-sized babies. The ones that were all the way off towards too small would pass away. The ones that were the way too big would pass away. But now, thanks to medical technology, we're able to see babies that are surviving at even smaller and smaller weights, and we're being able to see babies that are surviving at huge weights because we have C-sections now. And so this is called selective pressure. So this is kind of an interesting picture. When I started Googling what is the biggest baby that was ever born, there was a baby in Guatemala that was born 22 pounds. And I think about how big a 22-pound baby would be. We're used to seeing, 8 or 10-pound babies. Imagine 3 times that size. The mother was diabetic and didn't know it, so she was packing in the calories and packing the weight on the baby, and then when she went to give birth, she had a C-section and had the biggest baby ever born. And then I Googled the smallest baby, and so this baby was born a preemie at 22 weeks and weighed less than 10 ounces, so about the size of a ballpoint pen. And if you look at the picture of how tiny the feet are, I think that's just amazing. And that baby is doing just fine today, whereas, maybe even 20 years ago, this baby would have never been able to survive. We're kind of undoing what nature has done up until now thanks to medical technologies. I mean, I can even say that about myself. I'm diabetic, and, 50 years ago, I probably wouldn't have survived to the age that I'm at now. And so thanks to technology and my good old insulin pump, I am going to have a long and happy life. So this looks like kind of an odd question, and this is the question where ethics and science meet. When we're talking about ethical questions in science, we think about things like, should we save every baby that is born? I mean, somebody like me says yes, save every baby that is born. But what happens if they're not going to have any quality of life? What if that means the baby's going to die in 2 weeks, or going to grow up severely deformed, or grow up to be severely mentally retarded? What if we did this in nature too, where we tried to save every baby animal that was born also, but we had then problems with the animal populations that we had out there? These are ethical questions that science can't really answer. When you say, can we? Sometimes you say, should we? And it's something that you have to kind of think about how you feel about those different types of things. When I look at this, I also think of questions about stem cells, or about embryonic stem cells, where they have stem cells that are being taken from discarded embryos. I've been one of the biggest proponents of stem cell research because I believe fully that at some point stem cells are going to cure my diabetes. They're going to cure a lot of the different diseases that we have out there. But then I think, what about the embryo that is basically being dissected in order to get that stem cell from it? So should something die in order to save something else? It's really a heart-wrenching question, and for some of you, religion plays a big part in this, and for some of you, it doesn't. And those are questions that we'll have to answer, that there are no right answers to. So moving back into the science of it a little bit, that's kind of the ethical quandary of it. So we've talked about directional selection, where we are where we are breeding something in one direction to have more milk or bigger breasts. We talked about stabilizing selection, where we're trying to not get the smallest and not get the biggest, but get the ones that are right there in between. The third type of selection that we have here is called disruptive selection. This is one where individuals with extreme phenotypes experience the highest fitness, and those with intermediate phenotypes have the lowest. So what this means, let's say we're looking at a species of salmon. And if the salmon is a very, very large size, then it's going to have a better chance of survival than if it were a medium size. But if it was a small size, it would also have a good chance of survival. So whereas the population before might have all been medium-sized salmon, the ones that are the largest will have a good chance of surviving, the ones that are the smallest will have a good chance of surviving, and the ones that are in the middle are just kind of out of luck. And so here we see two different types of selective pressure where we've got our species are evolving to be larger and to being smaller and not to being in the middle. And so eventually what we'll see in a situation like that is at some point speciation will occur, where the larger ones will become their own species and the smaller ones will become their own species, and they will exclusively breed within those types of populations. So natural selection can cause the evolution of complex traits and behaviors. From looking at the betta fish, you saw that this evolution of this very aggressive, very territorial fighting behavior is something that has helped them to be able to survive and pass on their genes to their offspring, because if you put two fish together, one of them is going to be dominant over the other one and is going to display the best traits that show that it is the strongest and best able to survive. And then the ones that don't are not going to be able to pass on those traits to their offspring. So we see this complex evolution of behavior along with the traits that go with it. And as you know, nothing is ever just traits. It's always behavior that goes along with it too. Here we see an example of behavior being passed on from parents to offspring. If you look at rats and their ability to run a maze, what scientists have been able to do is train rats to be able to run through this maze very quickly. In 1954, there was a scientist who trained a group of rats to run through a maze for a food reward. And so if you are the smartest rat and you're able to best navigate that maze and you're able to best get to that food supply, then the smartest of the rats are going to be the strongest and the fattest and the happiest, and are going to pass that characteristic on to their offspring. So if you look at the graph, you can see that over generations, you've got the maze dull rats, which are the ones that make the errors in the maze. They're selected and bred with each other. And then the maze bright rats, the rats making the fewest errors in the maze, are selective and bred with one another. And so they've been able to breed these together to make each one of the populations basically diverge from one another. So after 6 generations of selection, the maze bright rats made only half as many errors as the maze dull rats. So they could actually breed intelligence into these offspring of these rats. And so if they can do it in rats, then you know that the next step is to try it with a higher mammal and a higher mammal and a higher mammal, until eventually can we breed intelligence into humans? That's another ethical consideration. So one of the questions that's often asked about evolution is, how did it ever begin in the first place? How could something like a wing ever evolve? Because it's not like if you only have 1% of a wing, you can fly. So scientists have asked these questions, and they've gone back and they've looked into the fossil record, and they looked at organisms that have wings, and they asked the question, how could natural selection produce an insect wing when a primitive wing nub, so having just 1% of a wing, would really have no aerodynamic benefits? They said, why would you have a wing if your wing didn't help you fly? And so what they found by looking back at the fossil record is that if a insect has a nub of a wing, the wing will actually help it in thermodynamics. So it will help it be able to cool its body. So they have theorized that wings didn't begin as ways to take flight, but they may have begun as ways to cool off the insect body, that eventually, as they got bigger and bigger and bigger and helped the insects to cool their body and keep cooling, and they bred bigger and bigger wings, at some point this organism was able to use that wing not just as a thermoregulator, but as a wing for flight. And so if you look at the evolution of wing size over time, you can see it starts off very small. It's got a very small thermodynamic benefit. Then as that is bred into the population, you see that the wing nub reaches an intermediate size where it begins to offer some benefits to the insect, and therefore natural selection is going to choose for having wings. And then when it gets to the end of the functional shift, it's going to have something that does something that it wasn't originally meant to do, but is just kind of this nice perk that helps the organism to then end up being able to survive really, really well in an environment. So you can see from this graph that we have thermodynamic benefits that only go up to a certain point, but once it reaches that intermediate phase, the wing provides another benefit, which is the benefit of aerodynamics or the benefit of flight. And so things may have started off, or traits may have started off doing things that we didn't expect that they would do, and then as they evolved over millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years, they may have done something that was an added benefit, and we call that a functional shift in the organism. And I think we're going to end off right there. One of the things I would like to let you know is that some of you have been asking me, can you put the study guide up any sooner? The reason I've always said no, that I don't put it up sooner, is because I don't make my study guides until I make my tests. So I posted an old study guide from my last third test from last semester. So if you want to use that as a basis to start studying, you know that's going to be the same stuff that's going to come up on this exam. So if that helps you to start studying now, please start studying now. Like I said, I think that this test is easier than genetics, but I don't think that an easier test is not still a hard test. So if you have further questions about that, definitely ask me, and I will let you go from there.